All right. Good to see everybody here. My name's Mike. This is Ronnie. This is the Mike and Ronnie show here this morning. So we want to talk about designing web APIs. And actually, what we want to talk about is we're really just going to have a candid conversation between the two of us. Ronnie and I travel a lot. We get to talk to a lot of people and deliver this material to a lot of locations. But one of the things that's kind of rare is for us to be together. So it's really cool. We've been together this week, prepping for the fall, creating new material, talking to folks here at the office. So this is a chance for us to really kind of have a conversation and include you guys. So you can post some questions in the WebEx. You can also tweet the hashtag L7webinar, and we'll collect up those questions and answer them along the way. So it's really good to see you guys, and I'm going to turn it over to you. Yeah.
Now, I'm looking at this picture. You look a lot better.
Yeah, I don't understand this picture. We've talked about this before. I don't know if this is me about to jump somebody. But I look like this angry guy in that. Maybe I need better glasses. I don't know.
So we have a couple of talking points, but we're going to divide this up into really three sections. We'll talk a bit about the past, where we've come from, kind of the world as we know it now, right? Before we start exploring, we'll talk a bit about the present we're in. I think we're really in this kind of space, right? We've left Earth. We're exploring the stars. And then we'll get into some future stuff. Is there intelligent life out there? Are there ways to take APIs even further?
Right. Absolutely. Cool. Yeah.
By the way, if you want to maximize the video, if you're more interested in seeing us than seeing the slides, there is a way to do that. There's an icon on the top right of the video feed you can click, and you'll see us in big screen. Okay, so let's start with the past.
So this is a great question. I get this all the time, so I'm asking you: is SOAP dead? Is SOAP gone?
No, I don't think so. I mean, what is dead? What is it? Punch cards? Are they dead? SOAP still makes a lot of sense, right? In SOAP, we have an application protocol that's transport agnostic. I used to work at a bank, and we purposely chose SOAP because it let us switch from HTTP to MQ, for example. There's still a lot of people who rely on SOAP, right? We don't want to leave them behind and just move on to other things, so it becomes even harder for them to integrate. I think it's fair to say maybe there's domains now where SOAP doesn't make sense for new APIs, right?
So, you mean the sense that like there's certain business domains, or is it just more like if you're starting today kind of thing? Like what do you mean?
If you're planning to integrate mobile applications, SOAP's probably not a great choice, right? If you're integrating browser-based apps, maybe not SOAP.
So I've invested a lot in SOAP, right? We've talked about this before. We've talked to customers about this, but I need to support mobile apps. So do I rip all the SOAP out of my infrastructure? Do I kill all the componentry, all the compiled bits that does SOAP now?
No, absolutely not. And we've been through this before, right, in the enterprise. So there's still a lot of IMS. There's still a lot of COBOL. There's even probably some Corba somewhere.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
The real way to move forward is to adapt and extend and put in a layer of abstraction so we can switch between protocols and make it painless for the person providing the service as well as for the person consuming the service.
Right, and this sort of talks about, we talked about this before too. I keep going back these last couple of months to this Pat Hellen paper when he was at Microsoft. We talked about data on the outside versus data on the inside, right? Just because we're using SOAP as an infrastructure internally doesn't mean that we have to use it on the outside that way too. Like, so the transformation, the adaptations, the facades, the other things make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Now, we definitely, we have cases where customers say, well, doesn't this add a lot of overhead, this facade thing? Shouldn't it always be just sort of pure and native? I mean, how do we deal with that? How do you talk to people about that? I mean, does it always have to be end-to-end, the same communication model all the time?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
I mean, even if we look at SOAP as an application protocol, we've got that stack. If you talk to one group of people, they talk about the stack as complex, right? They see the picture.
Sure. Yeah.
They read about WS transactionality and they get scared. Right? But the reality is there's a lot of good value in there, right? If you need to do encryption and for example, at the message level, you have a system there that works and you can rely on across protocols.
Yeah.
think that makes sense.
Well, I think we also talked about, too, the fact that the SOAP stack is a great developer experience, right? So I got a SOAP button, right? I've got a button on my developer tool, whether it's Visual Studio or Eclipse or even command line tools. So it's easy for me to work in this space. I don't have to hand draw all this stuff by myself, and there's a lot of value in that. And there's a lot of education behind it, too.
So underlying what we're saying is you pick the tool that works best, right?
Yeah.
Given the circumstance, given the context. I think that's good guidance.
Yeah, and that's what we see our customers doing, right? We don't see people like just ripping this out of whole cloth, right?
No.
Yeah.
Because they're integrating, right?
Oh, yeah.
So,
okay.
Is integration dead? You've gone on the record and said this.
Yes. So I did a blog post. What was it? A couple weeks ago. Integration, not integration, but interoperability, right? So and it created a stir. So yeah, I'm going to say integration is a problem. In some ways, integration is kind of dead. So what I really mean by that is, if you think about it, a lot of what we've done over the last 10 years is try to create whole systems, like a single unit of experience, right? But I think one of the things that mobile's teaching us now, one of the things that this whole idea about lots of sensor devices and lots of other things is teaching us is that so-called whole is getting bigger and bigger all the time, and that maybe trying to make it all one whole is not the approach. What you want to do is make it interoperable, do things that are going to interoperate with each other. So that's sort of the message.
So I want to make sure I understand here. So we are still going to integrate things, right? We're still going to bring applications together. We're still going to bring mobile apps together with back-end systems, right? So that still happens?
Yeah, they need to work together. That's right. Absolutely.
Okay.
In fact, I think they need to work together much more than they are now. And that's sort of why I wrote that post about interoperability. I think very often this is sort of like the SOAP thing, right? So do I need this native? Do I need this single conversation model from end to end? And in fact, no. Very often we have intermediaries and we have transformations. And if you think about interoperability, then I don't have to worry about solving the entire problem when I do one thing. Like I can create one thing. It's like the Unix thing. Do one thing and do it well, right?
Right.
So I can focus on making sure this works well, but that it is interoperable, right? So I think that's really sort of the message. So when I talk about this very often, I say don't focus on getting everything to work the same. Focus on getting everything to be interoperable, and I think you win.
So you're saying really build something today that will work in the future? Is there kind of a time shift?
Yeah, well, that's a really good one too, right? So I talk about this sometimes. Time is actually an architectural element, right? So you need to think about that. We all know from the days when it used to take us 6 months to a year to do large projects, the rules would change by the time we were done, right? So we think we need to make that distance shorter between start and finish. But the rules are still going to change, even if they don't change by the time I get that first mobile app out. Within weeks or months, it's going to change, and I got to get another mobile app out. So thinking about time and making it possible for us to do things later really pays off.
So I know you like to be provocative, right?
Really?
Is this a case of that? I mean, because you're talking about big picture stuff. We have people who need to design today.
Yeah.
What do they do today to accomplish this?
So, my version of it, and yes, I do speak provocatively a lot, but what I tell people is focus on doing something really well today. Do that one thing really, really well, and make sure that you have a boundary where people can interact with it. In other words, if I built a component that really does analytics really, really well, what I'd want to do is put an interface on it or put an API on it that's negotiable. We talked about this before. Like there are lots of ways. So maybe I want to represent that as HTML, represent that as Siren, or represent that as Atom. So I make that a feature. So I don't have to worry about deciding now how they're going to connect to me. I worry about doing a really, really good analytics tool, and then I add that connection piece later.
Yeah, I think that sounds wonderful. If we can get to that point.
Yeah.
But, it always feels like there's this gap between where we want to go and what we can do.
Absolutely.
And I guess that's the fun.
For me, that's the fun, right? You can tell I love that crap, right? But yes, I think also it's easier to build if you think that way. If I don't have to solve a big problem, I just have to solve a small one, and I have confidence that there's an interface or a way that other people can do things later, that's what I like. To use Donald Norman, right? Donald Norman's thing, the the evidence of a great object design is that people can use it in ways the designer never really thought of, right? Being able to use this and create an interface so that other people can do really creative things with it, I think, is what we want to do.
So we have some people chiming in. I mean, there's a lot of agreement with this concept, right? Looks like Jorge is talking about they're building a system where web apps work together and communicate. So there's kind of an inherent design where there's a bunch of individual pieces that are designed to interoperate together to form a bigger solution.
Right.
Which is what you're describing.
Yeah, which is what I'm talking about. And even design, design not only so that they'll interoperate with things that we know, but even be prepared to interoperate with things that we don't yet know. That's the time factor, right? And if we use these standard interface patterns, in the case of HTTP, it's message. Messages are what we standardize, right? So whether it's, Atom or HTML or Siren or Collection JSON or HAL or these other things, if we're prepared to talk in those languages, then things that we haven't even thought of yet, we'll be able to use it. Yeah, definitely.
So it's kind of this, we've talked about this before, as we've moved forward in this space, there's kind of a focus on first just getting things to talk to each other.
Yeah.
How do we connect things?
Yeah.
And it seems like we're slowly, as we go through these generations, moving towards maybe what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, I think I see lots of evidence in customers that we work with today that this is what they're working on. They're working on making this possible. So to see that in the field, to see people working on that problem is very, very encouraging.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
So let's move to what we're actually seeing, right? What's happening today and what are the big questions that we need to answer? And this is kind of a big one. What is the best way to describe APIs? How do we communicate them? To whom are we communicating them? What are the methods? It seems like there's a lot of confusion in this space.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if it's confusion, but there's definitely a lot of attempts, right? I dug around on this a little bit because I was working on another project, and I just started listing all the ways we've tried to describe. Basically, it's IDLs, right? It's description languages of some kind. So, we've got the WSDL, we've got Waddle, we've got Atom Service Description, we've got Swagger, we've got IODocs, we've got JSON Home is a thing that's in flight right now. There was a great paper just a couple of weeks ago by Eric Wild and some people at EMC, Resource Service Description Language, so it's not web service, that's not web application, but resource-based.
Okay.
So there's all these things going on, and that tells me that we need something. That tells me that this is definitely not just some spot where this is like a boring zone, but it also tells me that we haven't quite hit on a thing that people can coalesce around. Yeah, okay. We definitely need to describe them. I got some questions on how much we actually really need to describe to humans and how much we need to describe to machines. I think that's another big thing.
What do you mean? Dig into that a bit.
So I think one of the cool things about WSDL is that WSDL is very machine-friendly. I mean, no human can read that. Some humans can, like they're infinitely smarter than I, and sort of sort out what that service is really about. That web service description document has all of the, requests and responses and data types and return types, but it's very machinable. So that's why we can have a button in Visual Studio and Eclipse and all that, right?
Right.
Some of the more recent descriptions seem to be human-based. Like Swagger and IO for IODocs for a lot of focus is on actually getting the actual human documentation up and running. Mm-hmm. Swagger has some good features because actually Swagger has some interoperability and some machinability. So it's not really quite the same. But I see a real emphasis right now because we do a lot of this URI-based, sort of CRUD-based design. A real emphasis on human-readable documentations. Read these documentations, know what these methods are, know what these payloads are, know what the URI construction rules are, and write the code. So we've trying to kind of move from that machinable version to humans writing libraries. So we rely on jQuery and Angular and Bootstrap and all these other things. So I think we need to get back to doing more machinable stuff.
I don't know. I mean, I think we're seeing progressive evolution towards something that works. In the HCI field, there's a kind of prevailing thought, this machine-to-machine stuff might not even exist, right?
Yeah. You talked about that, yeah.
Humans are designing for humans, ultimately, right?
Yeah, no matter, even if machines are talking, humans are at each end, right?
I design a service today that you might design an application to use tomorrow, right?
Right.
If we lose that element that a human is connecting to a human, there's something. I think we lose something there. I appreciate the value of WSDL. I think where I see trouble is when people try to apply that same binding mechanism to the newer API styles, and they get into trouble, right? I've had discussions with customers of ours who, are adamant that they should be able to just email the WADL file to their developers, and that's documentation, right?
And that's documentation, like that's human documentation.
Absolutely. That's the perception.
Okay. Yeah. So that's good. So I do this too, right? So I'll say things like, well, if you use hypermedia, you don't need documentation, right? Sort of the same, and that's kind of the same thing you're saying, right? It's like that's a nice extreme point of view if you want to start a bar fight, but it's not really helpful, right?
Right.
So I think I agree with that. Here's another aspect of this. WSDL and WADL and some of these are really service descriptors, right? They're sort of standalone pieces. Google has a sort of a service discovery idea, right? So, and I think Jason Holm wants to be a sort of a discovery model too. So that there's supposed to be like a machine sort of visits a well-known address on the server and learns what I can start to do or something, like I discover along the way. And then I think there are more of these sort of live interoperability, like hypermedia tries to do that but do it live. Like I'll promise you ahead of time certain things may appear, so as long as you know that, I can put them anywhere and put them in any order I want. So I think that's another trend. So standalone description, which is usually design time. This discovery thing, which I have to tell you I'm a little vague on.
Yep.
Very often discovery is still used at design time. And then sort of this real-time sort of hypermedia pattern. And this one hypermedia model that we know today that we think of as links and forms may not be the best, right? So there are a bunch of things that we haven't really discovered in that space. In reality, maybe there's going to be a blend of that.
Right.
Because hypermedia in line has no human readables, right?
So I sense a theme here. I mean, when we talked earlier about SOAP, there's kind of this idea you have different tools, you apply them as necessary. There's an equal complexity here. If the audience is human, if we're trying to reach a developer to build an application, we have a way of describing an interface. If the goal is to reach the search crawlers or other machines to discover an interface, we have a way of doing it. I guess it turns out solving these problems is more complex than people want.
Or there's more than one problem, right? So in other words, there's not a one-size-fits-all. There's not a one ring to rule them all kind of idea, right? That, yeah, there are cases where this is the focus, and sometimes there are other descriptors that you need. I think it's a good point. That's good.
So is there a way forward? Do you have some magic to tell everyone about? Are we going to get to a one standard to rule them all?
I don't think we'll get to one. I've written about this recently. Leonard and I have worked out a thing we called ALPS, or application level semantics, profile semantics, which is a sort of a different run at this problem. Right. We're not really sure if this is the right solution or if it's a solution for everyone, but it actually takes a different tack, which is how to describe the space rather than the specifics. So it's more of rather than instance, it's sort of class. It's not object but class kind of style, but it's very, very early on. I think what I noticed when I was doing the research on that is we have lots of attempts. That tells me that we have lots of possibilities. Some of these may get better at it or may be closer to it, and I think we have a lot more work in there. And I think it's actually a very exciting space. I really do.
Okay, awesome. So what else is going on nowadays?
Let's see. So, okay. So OAuth 2, we get asked this a lot. I'm asking you now, is this the real deal, or do I need to just move on to something else?
So if the question is really, should you implement OAuth 2? Absolutely. Yeah, you don't have to hedge around this. I mean, I know there's a lot of finger-wringing about should we implement this thing?
Right.
Is it RFC yet? I read a blog post that said OAuth 2 is hell, and what do I do? I think it's becoming validated. We're seeing a lot more APIs use it. We're also seeing a lot more stories about exploits in the OAuth 2 space, right? Improper use of state parameters, of redirects, right? Ways to attack OAuth 2 providers. But I would say for the problem we're trying to solve, having an end user, an application, and an API, and managing all of these different identities and ways of having delegated authorization towards resources, this is the best tool we have at the moment. And it's continuing to evolve with things like OpenID Connect and user-managed access, and certainly I think it's the way forward, right? What's interesting about this space, it relies so much on TLS, right?
Right.
which or SSL as it used to be, which really relies on encryption, and encryption relies on things like mathematics, factoring. So Bruce Schneier, who talks a lot about security, talking about this thing called the cryptopocalypse.
Good job.
So the fear is that if somehow it becomes easier to start forming factors, right, to factor numbers, we really lose that whole base, right? This is kind of a crazy thought. Our entire security system is based on the idea that it's incredibly difficult, right, to break these cryptographic algorithms. It costs a lot of resources. As attackers build stronger systems, we use longer keys.
It's an arms race.
If this whole system falls apart, we're in trouble. So that's kind of like the Mayan apocalypse. The sun's going to explode someday. In the short term, though, OAuth 2 over TLS is going to get you really far.
Why would I, if I already have OAuth 1 or 1A, right, why would I switch to 2?
There's an easy way to answer that. Go build a client that uses OAuth 1, and then build a client that uses OAuth 2, and then you'll know which OAuth is hell. Right?
So is this mostly like the client-side challenge at this point, or?
I think that's a big part of it. I mean, in terms of really, which one should you use? It's just without an SDK or client tooling, OAuth 1 is really, really difficult. For those of us who've lived through SOA, with XML signature and XML encryption, you need to understand a lot of that stuff to get an OAuth client going. And on this topic too, if you're building an API, please make a distinction between using your API for developer space when developers first interact with your API and when they need to use it in production, right? You don't have to OAuth 2 everything. Don't make them learn how to securely access your API at first touch if they don't need to. Right?
Oh, that's interesting. So there are certain, like either in a test case or a sandboxy case, where that's not essential to the workflow. Like you can just leave that aside for now, right?
It's going to depend on the context, but you don't want to overwhelm developers, make them work really hard just to even explore your API, right? We need to have different levels of security. We need to have different classifications and different levels of resources we're protecting.
Yeah, so I think that brings up another thing, which has come up when we talk to clients, and that is that OAuth or the authentication experience is orthogonal to the rest of the interface. In other words, you have an interface and then you add authentication to it, like you make authentication part of it. So that interface could actually exist without a particular authentication pattern, right? Like could I, if I wanted to, I could just use, if it's a sandboxy experience, just basic auth or something over SSL, and then when I get into production, switch.
Absolutely.
Right? So that sort of makes that another separation of concern, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Authentication.
Although, I would argue if you implement something like basic auth, now you're teaching the developer to use basic auth, and then you're changing the rules when they go to I don't know if I would do that.
Okay.
Just be pragmatic.
Yeah.
Don't apply protocols in a blanket way without understanding what the purpose of what you're doing is, right? Think about everything from a developer perspective. And I think we'll talk more about that later.
Yeah, that's good. Everything from the developer's perspective, I think, and it's mostly from the client side, right? Is it also from the component side? Like if I'm deep in the shop and I'm the one who's got to build the components for the back end, right?
Yeah, no one cares about you. Unfortunately, right? It's really about how do we make it as easy as possible for people to use our APIs.
To use the
security tends to be a barrier. Let's make security as usable as possible and introduce it as late as possible, right? Protect your interests, of course.
Of course, yeah.
But do it in a way that creates the least friction, I think should be our goal. And the thing about basic auth, there's a lot of limitations with basic auth. It's really tied to a two-party system. It's not great for this kind of three-legged model.
No, yeah, it's really bad, right, yeah.
There's a question here from Jonas about OpenID Connect versus OAuth 2. I guess the question is really what's the difference. So,
no, I can't do this.
So OAuth 2 is really about authorized delegation, right? How do I access an API in a way that the user's credentials stay secret in case he doesn't trust the application acting on his behalf? That's the core of it.
Right.
There's a lot of permutations of that.
Yeah.
OpenID Connect actually sits on top of that framework to extend the conversation to the application learning about the user in an authorized way. So the example would be, We use GitHub to log into lots of sites. It would be nice if when you did that, you got a little window that said, hey, this application not only wants user credentials to connect, but also wants to learn about you.
Yeah.
Can it have access to your email address?
Right. Yeah, what do I want to grant, right? It's sort of that's the idea where I can actually start to grant some permissions to a particular service.
Because in the classic OAuth 2 case, that application is not part of the conversation. It never really learns anything about the user. This gives the app a chance to learn a little bit about you.
Cool. Right.
So there's an emerging concept of, I guess, hubs. Kind of referring to them as hubs, maybe curators of the API space, a place you can go. I see this a lot in the mobile space, for example. Hey, we're going to find a way for mobile developers to access APIs easier. I know Mike has thoughts.
Yeah, again, I've kind of come out on this in the last several months. So the short version of this is I think we're over-hubbing. I think we're creating a place where we're very dependent on some key pieces that are not easily replicated and they're not easily distributed. We're actually killing some of the distribution. We just had a thing, what was it, last week or this week, that magically Google or something was not available for a couple of minutes.
So the internet died.
Hey, yeah, that's the scale-pocalypse right there. Oh my God, if Google's not there. Right. And we have this with Amazon as well. We've got so many services that are so dependent now on Amazon services that if there's a hiccup, the system just really gets unstable. And of course, the original idea behind all this was to try to prevent that, right? Is to create this distributed pattern where you could plug servers in and out and it wouldn't actually damage the system in a big way. And I think we've kind of forgotten, or we're sort of leading towards this, as you mentioned, curation, aggregation kind of pattern for so many things. And it makes sense because we've got so many devices now. We've got so many possibilities. And we also, I think the thing you mentioned earlier is we have so much complexity. A lot of these aggregators and curators are sort of leveling the playing field. They're taking some of the complexity out of the developer experience. Like, think about the developer, right? Why do I have to know this Snowflake API and this Snowflake API? Isn't there just a general way I can do this? So I'm a little concerned that we're creating a lot of hubs. And even when I'm talking to customers, I encourage them to think about failure points in the system. Right. So make it possible so you can distribute this more. Some of this is just pure clustering, like make sure there's more than one, make sure you don't have session affinity. But I think also some of this is creating a situation where, as we talked earlier, it's easier for me to interoperate with individual items. I don't have to have this master player as the only source. So if something bad happens to that master player. And I think for individual enterprises and small businesses, that's not a big deal because you're not really big enough to really suffer this. But if you see how Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Amazon deal with these things, there are some things that kind of worry me in that space. And I think there are better ways to do it.
So when you talk about the enterprise space, I mean, if we think of enterprise integration patterns, the ESB is the classic case of API hub, right? And it's worked fairly well.
It's worked, and especially if you can distribute those and if you can cluster those, then you avoid a lot of that problem, including physically distributing them. Like, having a routing case where you sort of take on your own global routing, right? So if it turns out Europe is not performing well, I can route this to Asia, or I can route this to North America. And that means designing your applications that way too. So that your applications don't suffer that moment. Even from just simple distributed point of view from handhelds, we all know we can recognize on our handhelds applications that when the internet is down, they're worthless, but others actually really work.
Right.
That's protecting against that sort of hub idea, I think. I think that's part of it. Yeah.
I think it's fair to say today, though, there is a challenge for developers. 16 APIs that all speak differently.
Yeah.
Do you feel like we're breaking the model by introducing like an internet type of service bus, some layer of abstraction that separates the developer from the actual backend API?
Yeah, I don't know about breaking, but I think we're changing it, right? I think we just need to be aware of that. When I did a talk in San Francisco earlier this year, I was, my sort of marching phrase was be a node and not a hub. Create nodes. I think there's actually huge opportunities for creating more nodes rather than more hubs. The simple story is the difference between Yahoo's curated indexes in the 90s and Google saying, I can stop curating, I can stop creating hierarchies, let me just read the metadata about links, and they suddenly leapt ahead of the game by actually distributing that rather than centralizing that.
Right, so we went from those, if I remember, categories of lists, you drill down and find like 10 sites.
Absolutely, yeah. You would actually go through a hierarchy, which sort of mentally made sense in the 90s.
Right.
And I think Google taught us there's another way to do that. I think we can do the same. That works with search and links. I think we can start doing the same with services too. You mentioned this earlier. Like one of the things, if you're looking for an API, what do you do?
Yeah, I speak a lot to mobile developers, and they ask about finding APIs. You just Google search, right?
You search, right?
You need to find something you look for.
Yeah.
So certainly there's that. But but some of it is so Yahoo, certainly that model went away.
Yeah.
But there was a point in time where that made sense and it made Yahoo successful. So are we at a point in time where you can still be successful at the hub, but you need to keep an eye on where things are going?
Yeah, so switching from technical to business, I would say yes, absolutely. It's a great opportunity to reduce complexity, create more simplicity, and create great experiences for developers and so on and so forth. And I think smart companies will do that and continue to migrate that in, because think about it this way, when Google is down or Amazon is down or Microsoft is down, those guys, it isn't just an annoyance for guys like me, it's actually lost money for them. So protecting themselves against that pattern, I think, is what we need to think about as well.
So it sounds like a really complex idea, and part of it is helping developers build applications that can be right?
Yeah.
And we don't always have control over those developers. We need to find ways to influence behavior. So
yeah.
A lot of things to do there. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the future.
Futures.
And, I guess we'll tell everyone exactly what they need to do.
Absolutely. We got it all settled. You and we discussed this yesterday. Everyone's future is all settled.
And I once predicted that e-commerce would fail. I said e-commerce?
That's not going to make it.
No. Yeah. We won't make predictions, but we will talk about some of the stuff we're starting to see emerge.
Yeah, so this is a big one. DX. What is DX? And why do I even care about this? I think this is something that you talk a lot about.
Yeah, I love the idea of DX. I've really been digging into it. DX is short for developer experience, because I guess that's too long to say. Really, one thing you'll notice for Mike and I, we truly believe there's a lot of new things to look at, but this idea of standing on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah.
There's so much we've learned as an industry. We need to mine that. With DX, we're taking from the success that usability professionals have had.
Right.
So user experience is a really big thing in mobile applications, in web applications, right? Which goes all the way back to things like interaction design from Bill Moggridge and Don Norman and all these guys. We need to care because, most APIs, I'd say all of APIs, come down to two motivations: reducing cost, right? The cost of connecting, or increasing adoption rates, right? They want more people using these things. And to do that is very difficult, right? And you start out with, all of these complex choices of styles and protocols and discoverability and how do I do this and how do I do that. And it's very difficult to solve that problem sitting in a room, like just you and me sitting in a room and saying, what should we do here and what should we do here? DX really offers you a path to consider all those options from the developer perspective. Okay? But beyond usability is about how easy is something to use. DX encompasses the idea of, even what's the emotional reaction of things we're presenting? What's the context? How did a developer who wants to use our API reach this point in terms of learning, in terms of their exposure to our API? What's their background? What type of user are they? Enterprise or startup, mobile or web, right? So it encompasses a much larger idea.
So that's personas. Like I know this developer's enterprise developer, she expects a certain experience or certain things, right? Or I can expect a certain exposure level to certain technologies. Whereas if somebody's an iOS developer or somebody is...
Or not a developer.
Right.
We might be exposing APIs that we're hoping to integrate through something like IFTT or, someone less tech, maybe our quote-unquote grandmother should be able to integrate with our APIs, right? We need to think about all of that. And, more in line with what you've been saying, maybe our developer isn't a developer, maybe it's a machine, right? What's the Are we going to invent a new term right here? Is it going to be MX?
MX.
Right? Who knows? But the main idea is to consider everything from the outside in. We consider who we're building this for, and really try and gain insight into what that means.
So I consider that, but how do I know that? How do I validate that? How do I go about that? I mean,
that's a challenge, right? So you want to go beyond the...
Yeah, so I'll ask the question, I guess, right? Is that what I do? I actually have to, do I have to get up out of my desk and out of my office?
Again, so we're lucky because a lot of that practice has evolved in the UX field, and we can take that and literally drop it into the API space, right? So we can do all of the great prototyping, interviewing with developer clients, watching how they use our systems. There's a lot of great stuff out there that we can adapt into the API world. So absolutely, there's methodologies, frameworks, goal-oriented design. The challenge is, just like with OAuth, we have a different type of actor here, right? We have users as well as developers, right? It's a slightly different system. We're not designing chairs and we're not designing mobile applications. We're designing APIs. So there's a little bit of translation that has to take place. I'm particularly excited about things like behavior design, right? One of the challenges for API owners is to, motivate developers to build applications in a way that they want. I mean, so there's this idea of innovation, hey, let's see what springs up.
Yeah.
But there's also the ideas of brand control and, how do we build applications that will still work when the network is down. We talked about that, right?
Yeah.
So how do I motivate a developer to do that? How do I affect their behavior?
Right. Microsoft has this phrase. I love this phrase. Help developers fall into the pit of success.
Right.
Like, how can I lead them down the happy path, right? So I can actually design my interfaces. I can design my APIs to lessen the possibility that somebody makes a mistake, or lessen the possibility that they use some feature I really prefer they didn't, that's non-performant, all these other things, right? Joshua Block talks about that a lot when the Java guy, when he talks about creating APIs. Make sure that it's sort of hard to screw up and forgiving if you do, right? We can do all those things, right?
We can take it even further and make it a habit that's addictive. I get addicted to building an application.
So gamifying the API.
Absolutely.
Wow. Okay.
All of that, right? And I think that's what we're going to see more and more in the future, right? This is the way, as well as with things like hypermedia. I know you've talked in the past about hypermedia being a way of influencing applications.
Sure. Yeah. Giving them hints, giving them leading, right?
Right.
Leading along, so you can do the same thing. It's very cool. All right. Yeah.
So I've already seen a question in the chat about
Okay.
IoT. Everyone wants to talk about IoT. It's really cool.
Yeah.
My question here is, I wanted to frame this in a way that put Mike on the spot. Will IoT change everything we know about APIs? Is it going to just we have to start over and start from scratch?
So actually, there's a piece of me that wants to say yes to that question, but there's even a more nagging thing in the back of my head, right? So Internet of Things, industrial Internet, this all sort of addresses this notion of this explosion of devices. Depending on who you're speaking to over the last couple of years, people are predicting somewhere in the tens of billions of devices by 2020. Tens of billions of devices. And also, the ratio of devices per person is supposed to really go way up, too. If you just think about cars today, there are just tens and tens of sensor devices, addressable sensor devices on the vehicle itself, right down to the pressure gauge on a tire. There's a sensor device on cars. So there's all these things. So what does that mean for what we do? Does it change everything? Maybe it doesn't change everything, but it sure introduces a new set of problems. This goes back to the hubbiness that I was talking about earlier. If we have billions of devices, can they all go through hubs, or do they need to start acting much more independently, right? So think about sensor devices in a car. Well, they can probably talk to a central location. That's a car, right? But now think about tens of thousands of cars on the road. Do they all have to talk to one central place?
Right.
No. Well, they'll probably talk to some intermediate spots, but do they all have to roll up to one location somewhere out in the desert in underside of a mountain? Probably not. So I think what we're going to see in this pattern of the industrial internet is devices or groups of devices that act independently. So it's a little bit more like extending this notion of the phone not having to be connected in order to do some things. But that means that does change the way we think about protocols, changes the way we think about time, changes the way we think about machines. So a good example would be Google's driving car, right? The one that drives itself. That doesn't talk to anybody else. That makes all those decisions on its own based on what's around it. And I think we're going to see that notion of being able to make that decision independently get smaller and smaller and smaller.
Is there a sub-network within that car then?
Yeah, so there's lots, right, yeah, right. There's visual cues, there's all sorts of decision and analysis, and yeah, there's all sorts of other devices on that vehicle. But that vehicle actually acts as a machine independent, right? And it definitely sends information back, but it's not dependent, right? Think about pipeline systems where we're going to put sensors all over pipelines or all over delivery networks.
Right.
Or think about trucks. Think about eventually automating. Trains do this already, like individual train cars have tons of sensors on them. So I think this notion that the big thing is the Internet of Things will start to get us to think about doing things sort of sub-independent.
Right.
And there's new protocols now for this, right? We also have these limits. I really think that we'll end up going to the store at some time and just like, at the hardware store, collecting up a bunch of sensors that I'll plug into my house. Motion sensors, heat sensors, pressure sensors, water sensors, and I'll plug them into things. And they need to automatically talk to each other, and I can't program every one of those things. So they have to be cheap. They have to be like potato chips. They have to be commoditized. So that changes the way these devices communicate. They have to communicate in a much more simplistic way, and they have to be able to sort of find things around them.
Right.
So we have new protocols like CoAP, Constrained Application Protocol, which looks a lot like HTTP, but is designed to run over UDP instead. COAP. We have MQTT, so IBM has a sort of an adaptation of the MQ series that's for telemetry, and they have a version that's both TCP/IP and UDP friendly. But people trying to apply XMPP.
Why do we need all this? I mean,
because, well, a good example would be those sensor devices have very limited battery memory power, right?
So constraints.
Yeah, there's way new constraints. I can't use HTTP, just like willy-nilly. Good example would be the CoAP says the message can't be more than 4K. It just can't. It just can't. So there's all sorts of other constraints we have. I just saw a piece, somebody's figured out how to create these sensor devices that can actually pull information from surrounding devices like the generated electricity from nearby wires and stuff. So they don't even have their own batteries anymore. So this is really going to change the way we think about what we program and how we put things together.
Let's go deeper. I mean, but first of all, 5 years from now, do we have a slide?
Yeah, right. Well, there's stuff is going on now, right? So this stuff is in cars now, stuff is in buildings now. There's Zigbee and there's several other proprietary versions. Right. So I think what's the thing? We always overestimate what happens in 5 years and underestimate what happens in 10, right? So I think there's lots of possibilities here, but I think right now we're sort of at that cusp, and that's why I've talked about the hubby bits, the interoperability kind of ideas, because I think they will come into play for us. I think they will.
And of course, there's a kind of looming security issue here. I mean, smarter cars. We're going beyond just is your bank account safe to can you still protect your house, your car, your possessions, your family if everything goes smart?
Sure. We just had an announcement recently at one of these White Hat events where people took over a car. And they actually, while you're driving it, they can change the steering and they can put on the brakes.
Right.
This is possible now because they were able to break into the vehicle. So there are definitely possibilities. There's also vehicle, house, banking, all that stuff is going to exist. And if we have little agents running around doing things or sensors, ready to alert when you walk into a room, we have to think about those things. Yeah.
And if I have a stable of APIs I've created now and I'm looking towards this IoT future, I guess the question I would have is, have I wasted that money in investing in building these APIs, or can I bring those forward into this new world of IoT?
We're going to have to bring them forward, right? We can't be left behind, right? We're going to have to bring them forward. And I think that goes right back to what we talked about before. If we make the way we communicate a separation concern from the actual functionality, as new protocols appear, or as new formats appear, or as new device profiles appear, we can still participate. But if we build this stuff all in from front to back to just do one thing, every time something new comes along, we've got to pull wires out or greenfield projects over and over again.
So we have the problem of making sure we're ready.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I guess we also have the challenge. I mean, none of this is going to succeed if the end user experience is not good. So the people building the devices, we don't want to be blue screening on toasters.
Yes.
And then I think correspondingly, we have to adjust our DX for this new world, right?
Yes, I think you're right. DX is going to be even more important because we're going to need different personas, like you talked before. What am I really interacting with? What am I designing this for? I think you're right.
I think it's going to change everything in terms of you'll be targeting a totally different type of developer. The maker community.
Sure, it's huge. Yeah.
We've been going after all the guys who love to use URI CRUD up until now. Now you're going to get to a bunch of guys who love to build things.
Right.
And they need to access your API.
Yep, exactly.
How do we reach them?
No, that's very good. That's very
big questions.
Very good.
And another buzzword-worthy question, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Do you want to start? I mean, what is DevOps and why do people talk about it?
For me, I spend a lot of time on the enterprise side before. I kind of view DevOps as this idea of continuous improvement, and I think we've tried to do that in that world before with things like Antscripts in the Java world and bringing developers and operations closer together, reducing the cost of deployments. But it looks, from the outside looking in, like DevOps really offers an opportunity to do this rapidly and a lot, right? Like really making changes quickly and easily so that we can change our business, change our implementations without any friction. Yeah,
I think one of the things that's impressed me, DevOps kind of, original implementation was this Agile infrastructure, and it comes from Agile and Agile Manifesto and these other things. And Agile is very cultural, right? So one of the things I really enjoy about the Agile Manifesto is there's part of this thinking is not only how do we do this faster, but how do we not do this stuff? Like, why the hell are we doing this? Can we just drop this out and still get the end result we want, right? So very end result focused. Agile is also very much focused on this notion of sort of taking out ceremony and simplifying things and focusing on what's really important. And I think DevOps really picks up on that as well. So it isn't just running faster.
Right.
Very often it's completing things on a shorter path, right? So I don't have to do all the steps. I don't have to do all the things. That gets to be a bit of a cultural challenge, though, right, inside organizations. So if we have organizations that have really kind of grown up that kind of depend on ceremony or depend on this pattern of how, that's how we do things here kind of thinking, Agile and DevOps really challenge that space, right? I think we've talked about this, right?
So is this only going to be fostered in the startup community? Are we going to see it really emerge successfully?
No, I can tell you, I don't know about you, but I go to clients and they're talking about this now. Enterprise clients are talking about this now. Some of this is a little bit out of buzz, like, well, do we need to do this? Kind of like, do I need a web page, sort of like back from the 90s? But some of this is directly thinking about the cost of, the cost of ownership, the cost of production, the cost of maintenance. These are fundamental things. So it isn't just continuous integration, but a continuous improvement. So one of the other problems we have with small devices is people expect change more frequently, expect improvements, expect that feedback loop to be shorter, sort of the old Norman feedback loop, like I evaluate something, I make some change, I want to see some effect. When you say, well, yeah, we'll get to that bug fix in the next quarterly update, there's a whole bunch of people that are like, no. That's not good enough, so we need to change that. So DevOps gets affected by that as well. The ops community, the IT community, it's their job to make sure that stuff runs stable all the time, right? I don't care about your new fancy software. I don't care about your new fancy libraries, but I got to make sure this thing is running all the time. So this is a real critical issue for them, and if we are expecting this to get faster, they have to make sure, any of us in DevOps have to make sure that with that agility, maintains that stability, right?
And I guess I've certainly met a lot of customers who have been told to go faster.
Yeah.
But their hands are still tied with, gating processes and all of the stuff that comes with that. So I guess there's a cultural challenge here. There's a new way of thinking that needs to be adopted.
Right.
And is there design pieces that can help with that?
Well, yeah, I think there's a lot of design pieces. So I think when we talk about that notion of separation of concerns of interface, so you have this interface and you can express that in a different language or express that in a different form. You give some asynchronicity, you give some flexibility there, which means that I don't have to decide this now, so that's a gate that I don't have to actually go through, or it's a gate that I can put off, that I can have some confidence in later. So a lot of this has to do with knowing I'm in an environment where those things will work themselves out. I don't own every single thing, and I don't have to decide it now. And that can actually speed up some actions, right? Another one is this notion of lots of small changes over time add up.
Right.
So making a small change, if I can make just a minor change in the system and I can make that relatively safe and cheap, then I can make lots of minor changes. So a lot of times, continuous integration doesn't mean releasing an entire new version every Monday or every day, but it might mean changing the color of a button or changing the layout of the screens or adding one more feature to a subset of the community to get feedback, to get that big data, to find the results. So creating an environment, a framework, an infrastructure in an enterprise that allows that to happen and can maintain that stability while it does, that's a really big challenge. And there are lots of artifacts, right? Virtualization, testing, all these other tools that we have to animate deployment. There are lots of artifacts that we can introduce into the system in order to foster that aim, right?
So let's be honest, it's an emotional thing, isn't it? I mean, the barriers are put there because of fear. Right?
Yeah.
If we design a system that addresses the fear and offers great work, I mean, what you talked about.
Yeah.
Being able to iterate, evolve based on what we're seeing happening, that's massive. That could change everything. Right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. We do this because we're worried about the possible negative outcomes, right? If we can relieve some of that, give some consistency, some predictability, some manageability, right? We don't have to give that up. That's good.
All right. Good. So we've talked about a lot. There seems to be some central themes, right? As we look at the past, the present, and the future, we keep coming back to a few things. Certainly, I think a lot of this is about, not arbitrarily choosing what you're going to do, but actually selecting based on rational thought.
Yeah, and no one ring, right? Every one of these sort of came down to there isn't just one answer. There isn't just one problem, right? It's a set of problems, and we need to know who our audience is, what we're aiming for, what our goals are. Yeah, I think that's a good one, too. Yeah.
So no simple answers, but there certainly seems to be a way forward, right? It just
no single answers, right? I think that's one of the big ones, right? Yeah, definitely.
So we've had a few questions on the webinar. Let me just go through these.
Cool.
So one question is, how are APIs being adopted outside of U.S. and Europe?
Outside of U.S. and Europe, I'm not sure if I can really.
So really, it's a question. Kind of is this more of something that's happening only in the developed economies? Are we seeing, Asia Pacific?
No, I mean
emerging economies.
We were just in Australia, right? We did the seminars, the open workshops in Australia just last month, and I mean I'm getting the same kinds of information, same kinds of feedback. I'm seeing evidence of the same kinds of creative work there. I have not been in Asia. You've been in India, right?
There's a lot happening in India.
Yeah.
I'm seeing very little, years past, there used to be this kind of cycle of things happen in North America, then they happen in Europe, and then later they happen in Asia. And there's still a little bit of delay, but it's gotten so much tighter. I've met with Indian startups who are doing amazing things with APIs and backend data. I've met with large telcos who are planning on changing the way APIs are looked at in that space. So I think this transcends all of that. I don't think it's
So there's no sort of ghettos of innovation. This is really spreading. I mean, this is in our experience. I think there's evidence in all sorts of places.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's very good.
If you have any other questions, just throw them in. I'm just going through our log here.
Yeah, and you can also, I think there's an email address. You can send some stuff afterwards if you don't get a chance, or if you're watching this on delay. So there's a couple other possibilities there. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about what's coming up.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We didn't get to go too deep into any of these things.
No, we didn't. So one of the cool things is this is the week when you and I are spending time together with Alex and Matt and several other people to start talking, building the stuff that we'll start talking about in the fall. So we got a new series coming up, and so there's lots of locations on our list. You can see just from this list, and I'm not even sure this is all just for between now and the end of the year, right? Yeah. So this stuff about DevOps and IoT, tightening up a lot of other aspects of Mitra we do. So we're going to be in lots of places talking to people. And this is just our open workshop series. We're going to also be at several events, right? So what are you going to be doing?
We love to go to events, right? So the one I'm excited about, Nordic APIs, is coming up. I think that's next month. What month are we in?
Yeah, it's in September, right? Yeah.
That's going to be a big one. You know, I'm amazed at what's happening in Europe. Like in the last year, suddenly you have to choose which API to host, right? You never had to do that before.
Yeah.
I'm really excited about Nordic APIs. I'm always happy to see the Appy Days guys.
Happy Days in December, yeah.
Yes, I think that's Paris.
Paris in December, that's right.
We'll both be there?
Yeah, that's another chance I get to see you. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, and so at the same time, the same week you're at Nordic APIs, I'll be at ResFest in Greenville, South Carolina with Benjamin Young.
That's your conference.
Yeah, that's the thing. And I'll miss you this year. You were with us last year, but I understand. And then we've got San Francisco QCon, I'll be there. Alex will be there. Alex is going to be giving a talk there. Francois, one of our key guys here, is going to be giving a talk there, I think, as well. There's stuff going on in October that's kind of escaping me at the moment. There's like all sorts of things going on. Yeah.
So if you want to keep track of all this, just go to apiacademy.co, right?
Yep.
Find all this information there.
We keep posted there.
You've got a Twitter address?
Twitter address, MAMUND, so it's Mammond, at Mammond, yeah. And you?
At Mitra Man.
Mitra Man.
Yeah. So should we do one or two questions before we?
If we got a few, we got some time here, yeah.
So one of the questions was how do you address interoperability within industry domains? So specific industries, businesses need to interact with each other.
Yeah.
What's the best way forward?
So I have a poster child for this.
Okay.
Especially across industries. So we see lots of people trying to coordinate, industry communications. I think one of the examples I saw that worked really, really well was voice XML and call control XML. Okay. So what happened is we had vendors of set-top boxes, servers, software to manage call control systems where you could sort of route people and take messages and bridges and all these other kinds of things. And they all wanted to interoperate with each other in the same space, but they all had pluses and minuses, and they had competition in that space. So they didn't want to lose their competitive edge. What they did is instead of creating a single API to rule them all, they created a message format, which was called voice XML or call control XML. It was a kind of a language. It turned out to be a kind of a hypermedia format. What it meant was if all these devices could understand this language, this way to talk, every one of these devices could feature their own special niches. They could solve problems that other people weren't solving, but they could know as soon as I plugged in that we'd be able to communicate with each other. So I think one of the keys for these industry patterns is to find this way to talk to each other, not this way to actually do things. And when you get that sort of agreed way to discuss, then you open up innovation inside that space. You don't actually constrain innovation so that I have to use this one API call. I just have to send a message that has this kind of information in it.
And we've seen that fail a few times, right?
Yeah.
You just publish the industry API and the industry ignores it, it starts becoming irrelevant.
Well, it gets really tough because first of all, you've got to get industry representatives in a room to all agree on one API. Well, that's like murder, right? And then once you do it, several people are like, well, it's so baseline or so low level that it's not really helpful to me, so I'm not going to implement it. So it gets really hard. So
you need to define a data model or some type of model.
A communications model. You need to describe a way to communicate and a sort of a vocabulary, right? Okay. So I think those two things. So if you a way that a message is formed and the vocabulary of what you can expect. And if you're using the hypermedia pattern, you're actually going to describe the actions. This is how I add or search or delete or bridge or connect. You actually describe those things. Once you do that, you open up all sorts of possibilities. And but I think those are the key, the vocabulary and the message format. Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Yeah.
All right, so I think we're pretty much out of time.
Yeah, we've kind of gone over the hour. This has been fantastic. We should do more of this.
I agree.
We should really
from Vancouver.
Yes, and we should do more of it here in Vancouver.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Thank you very much. Hopefully this has been enjoyable for you, and hope to see you again soon at one of these events.